Dear colleagues, as we unfortunately had to cancel this year's World Congress in Montreal, we thought it would be a good idea to at least share some highlights from the virtual Congress that took place in February. Before the video starts, I would like to announce that the 2022 World Congress in Taipei, Taiwan will take place from June 9th to the 12th. I look forward to seeing you there in person, and now please enjoy the video. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel below for free so you can watch more videos in the next weeks. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about cannabis and psychosis, and particularly about the impact of cannabis use on the incidence of psychosis, and also whether predisposition to schizophrenia explains why people use cannabis. So there have now been 14 studies, prospective studies of cannabis use, and out of these, 11 of them have shown that cannabis use increases the risk of psychosis. 2 have shown a trend, and 1 has really shown nothing much. So I think we can take it that cannabis use is a contributory cause of psychosis. But how important is it? Well, this is a large incidence study that we carried out across Europe, and in five countries, we examined a big city, for example, like London, and a smaller town or a rural area like Cambridge. So London, Cambridge, Paris, and then a rural area called Clermont-Ferrand. Same in Holland, five centers in Spain, and 3 in Palermo. And we looked to see what were the differences in incidence. This was a very careful, cautious study. Everybody rated all the people who developed psychosis in a particular area over 3 years. And so here we're looking at daily use of high potency cannabis in London on the left and Amsterdam in the middle. And if you just look at London on the extreme left, there are people, the risk in people who have never used cannabis. And then we look going along towards the right, we see people who use low potency cannabis occasionally, then high potency cannabis occasionally, and so on. By low potency, we mean less than 10% THC, high potency above 10% THC. And in the green, at the right-hand side of London, you can see that the odds ratio, it goes up to 5 for people who take every day take high potency cannabis. So they are 5 times more likely to be psychotic than people who don't take cannabis. If you look at the same in Amsterdam, you can see that again, on the left-hand side, those who don't take much cannabis, but on the right-hand side, you can see the odds for daily use of high potency cannabis is 9 in Amsterdam. And that's because Amsterdam has much higher potency than London. So high potency in London works out about 16% THC. High potency in Amsterdam is nearer double that. So you can see that there's a big effect of the incidence of cannabis use on the risk of psychosis, particularly in these 2 cities. Now, we call high potency cannabis skunk because of the pungent smell it gives off. And so most people in Britain know that if you get cannabis, you should smell it to see whether it's the old-fashioned stuff or the high potency stuff. And here is our queen. She's a smart old lady, and she gets lots of presents, and she has learned that if anybody gives her cannabis, she has to be very careful. So she sniffs it and she sees whether it's the nice old stuff that used to be smoked. I don't know whether she ever smoked, but in the hippie days, in the 60s and 70s, or whether it's that powerful skunk that can send you mad. This, of course, is a spoof picture of the internet. This is work published in Lancet Psychiatry by my colleague Martha. We know that there is a geographic relationship between incidence of psychosis and cannabis. What about across time? The incidence of cannabis-induced psychosis more than doubled in Denmark between 2006 and 2016. Cannabis was decriminalized in Portugal in 2001. From 2002 till 2015, the proportion of psychosis patients diagnosed as cannabis dependent rose from less than 1% to over 10%. And in South London, we've got data on the incidence of schizophrenia since 1965, assessed in a standardized way, and schizophrenia has more than trebled over that period. And it looks as if cannabis is one of the major factors. So it's very suggestive that cannabis is having an effect on the incidence of psychosis, but could it all be due to people with a predisposition to schizophrenia using cannabis? So does genetic loading for schizophrenia influence cannabis use? And secondly, is there an interaction between a genetic predisposition and cannabis use? So that we can calculate the polygenic risk score for schizophrenia. What about, does cannabis use interact with a predisposition? This is a slightly complicated slide, but if I simplified it, along the bottom is the polygenic risk score for schizophrenia. So at the left-hand side, people without any predisposition to schizophrenia. At the right-hand end, people with a high predisposition to schizophrenia. And you can see that as you go from left to right, the odds of you becoming a psychotic increase. So up the left-hand side are the odds ratio for a psychosis. But what are these different colored lines? Well, they reflect how much cannabis use people have. And you can see at the top are people who use high potency cannabis every day. And on the bottom are people who rarely use cannabis. So so you can see that really it's the people who daily use who have the greatest risk. So right from the lowest polygenic score to the highest polygenic score, people who are daily taking cannabis use have a higher risk than people who don't use cannabis at all. So essentially what is happening is that there are two independent effects. There's the polygenic risk score for schizophrenia, which causes some people to be more predisposed to psychosis, and there's a cannabis use effect. And the two just add up. So you can become psychotic if you have no predisposition to schizophrenia, but you use a massive amount of cannabis. And you can become psychotic if you don't use cannabis, but you have a heavy predisposition to schizophrenia. But most people, it's the sum of both effects. So let me conclude. Genetic predisposition and cannabis use have independent effects on risk of psychosis. The prevalence of cannabis use does have an impact on the incidence of psychosis. Now, we can't do anything about genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, but cannabis use is important because it's preventable, and it's one of the major risk factors for a psychosis. So in my view, we should be having educational campaigns about the risks of daily use of cannabis. And sadly, cannabis use is increasing in most countries across the world. And if we don't do something about this, then I think we're looking forward to more and more psychosis. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank especially the organizers from this symposia first, and then the CIMP for organizing this virtually. Today, I'm going to be talking about the neuroimmune hypothesis of schizophrenia and cannabis use, particularly in its relevance to youth. And I'm going to be presenting novel studies using translocator protein, or TSPO, positron emission tomography PET. I'm going to be very briefly introducing the clinical high-risk state for psychosis. And the reason I'm going to be doing this is because most of the work in the psychosis spectrum will include this group. This group, it's a group that is identified clinically, and it identifies those who are at high risk of developing a full psychotic break. These can be identified usually using structured scales such as the SIPS here, and we know that about 25 to 30% of those identified as being at clinical high risk will go on to develop a full psychotic break around 2 years. So only 25 to 30% will actually develop. The prototypical TSPO radioligand, PK11195, has several limitations which prompted the development of the second generation radioligands, such as DAA1106, PBR28, and others, including F18-FIPA, which is the one that we used back then in Toronto. So the first step was to do the radiation studies just to confirm that the radiation dose is consistent with that of other F18 radiolabeled ligands. We also use kinetic modeling to quantify TSPO using the two-tissue compartment model. The outcome of this kinetic modeling is total volume of distribution here, and or VTs, and this is going to be our main outcome throughout the presentation today, meaning that higher total volume of distribution or higher FIBA or F18-FIBA VT represent higher TSPO density. We learned that there is a polymorphism in the TSPO gene, RS6971, which affects second generation radioligands. As you can see here in the figure, people can be identified as being either high affinity binders, medium affinity binders, or low affinity binders. And as you can see clearly here on the y-axis, VTs for FIPA, and on the x-axis, different brain regions, have, or high affinity binders, have about 20% higher binding as compared to medium affinity binders. Low affinity binders cannot be quantified with F18-FIPA or with any other second generation radioligand. So because of this, our group in Toronto, but many others before me and after me, were interested in understanding neuroinflammation as quantified with TSPO PET in brain of patients with schizophrenia. Here you have a summary of all the studies, starting with Van Berkel being the first study in 2008, and here DBS in 2017. There's some studies which are published more than once, but I'm going to be presenting today these 3 studies that we published. One is the King study in 2015. The second study is Hafizi study in 2016, and finally Hafizi 2017. As you can see, there is no major finding from most of these studies, and this seems to have been replicated across most of the studies over the years. So the main aim was to use FIPA to examine neuroinflammation or neuroimmune activation in the psychosis spectrum. And just a brief word about this. I am using neuroinflammation and neuroimmune activation interchangeably. They are not the same, and I'm just using them for ease here, but I'm happy to discuss questions about this during the Q&A section. So we wanted to explore the association between neuroinflammation or neuroimmune activation and gray matter volume, symptom severity, and psychological deficits. And we hypothesized that patients in the psychosis spectrum will show higher neuroinflammation or TSPO expression as compared to healthy volunteers. And a reminder that our outcome measure is F18-FIBA VTs. So then, because of this, and because we were interested in further trying to understand the neuroinflammatory or neuroimmune hypothesis of schizophrenia, we decided to investigate or to study long-term cannabis users. And the reason we did this is because the immune response has been involved in cannabis use disorders. In particular, regular cannabis use has been associated with long-term changes in the brain, making it a growing public health concern in youth, particularly given the legalization trends across the world. Cannabinoid signaling has been shown to play a critical role in the modulation of inflammatory responses. However, clinical evidence remains sparse. Preclinical studies have reported anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressant effects of cannabinoids by inhibiting microglial activation, inhibiting release of ROS, decreasing pro-inflammatory cytokine secretion, and increasing anti-inflammatory cytokine release from microglia. Tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol are also currently being investigated as potential therapeutic agents for several inflammatory conditions and immune conditions, including schizophrenia and the putative CHR for psychosis.